Nocturne asks, can you talk about the series of abandoned subway stations beneath Chicago and the strange things that inhabit it? The accounts from online forums are confusing, to say the least. Nocturne, there are many surprising things beneath the city of Chicago. I'll focus on one item in particular, something I personally find fascinating but feel doesn't get enough attention, and that is the miniature model of the city. Perhaps you've seen pictures of this before. It appears to be nothing more than a well-crafted model of Chicago, constructed from hobby store parts, buildings, streets, and trains. Most folks don't even consider the miniature city as a supernatural manifestation. But they're wrong. The model city was first discovered beneath the Green Mills, a restaurant and speakeasy frequented by Al Capone back in the 1920s. Late one night in 1928, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, part owner of the speakeasy and one of Capone's right-hand men, used the secret tunnels beneath the Green Mills to evade police capture. A few blocks from his establishment, he found a long, wide table. It stood in the middle of a sewer passage, taking up almost the entire space. On the table was a replica of Chicago. But as he was actively fleeing the law, McGurn had no time to examine the model further. He tried to find the miniature Chicago a day later with others, but it was no longer down the tunnel he'd escaped. People dismissed McGurn's sighting as a made-up story, and that was that. Until in 1948, when a Chicago Transit Authority worker named Brent Armstrong found the miniature city in an unused freight tunnel downtown. Brent Armstrong had two advantages over McGurn in that he had a flashlight with him, and he'd never once even jaywalked, so no policemen were pursuing him. Armstrong spent hours examining the miniature city and made sketches in a notebook he carried. One oddity, he noted, was the inclusion of a blue line of the L train. The blue line wouldn't come into existence until 1958. Like McGurn, Armstrong tried to bring others back to where he found the miniature city, but it had disappeared. In 1960, it manifested once again. A young girl named Ulma Simpson went exploring down an open sewer tunnel not far from her Englewood home. Several hundred feet in, she found a table with the miniature model city on top. Ulma noted that there was a gigantic black building that stood higher than all others in the miniatures downtown. This was, of course, the Sears Tower, which wouldn't be constructed until 1970. There have been a handful of other sightings over the years. The last I'll share involves a difference to all others. In 1998, an architectural student at Northwestern named Keller Stiles spent his nights and weekends exploring different underground sections of Chicago in search of the miniature model city. His tenacity paid off as he eventually found it in an abandoned Red Line subway tunnel. Stiles had little interest in figuring out what the city might look like 10 years in the future. He wanted to make a change to the city himself. Since he was young, Stiles had dreamed of a gigantic spire bursting from the earth and dominating the Chicago skyline. But his blueprints and models were not taken seriously by his professors. They called his twisting tower impractical. The Northwestern architecture program threatened to expel him if he didn't submit more conventional designs. Instead, Stiles devised an implausible plan to make sure his spire would one day become reality. When Keller Stiles found the miniature city, he had brought with him a model of his spire. There's no record of anyone attempting this before, but Styles added his model to the miniature city. He placed the spire off Lakeshore Drive, just north of Navy Pier. He spent no time looking over the model city, and he made no attempt to look for it a second time or bring others back with him. He did what he came for, and was satisfied. Keller Styles failed out of the architecture program. He never became an architect, but he was not surprised in 2006 when he got the call to design a gigantic structure off Lakeshore Drive. They broke ground in 2007, but the person who'd hired Keller was a con man, using large construction projects as a series of Ponzi schemes, the Chicago Spire being the largest he'd ever attempted. The con man was arrested months into construction. All building finances were seized by the government. The Chicago Spire would never be fully constructed. And yet, it appears, with some regularity, as if some force outside of reality insists it must be part of our city. An ideal that demands our city look or be a certain way. I'm sorry, Nocturne, that got a little away from what you asked about the Chicago Underground. But I hope you'll agree the miniature model city of Chicago, which, as I've said, many dismiss as not even being supernatural, is in fact possibly one of the most powerful supernatural items in our fair city.